Most people who have studied psychology are familiar with Abraham Maslow and his hierarchy of needs. And even people who haven't studied psychology are familiar with the hierarchy of needs. Now, at the top of the hierarchy of needs is something called self-actualization. And in general, most people associate self-actualization with living your best life, being the most authentic version of yourself, feeling fulfilled, doing what you love. Okay? And these are definitely part of what self-actualization is. However, if you go into Abraham Maslow's books and read what he was writing about self-actualization, you realize that fulfillment is only part of the story. In Abraham Maslow's research, he actually saw self-actualization as an issue of human potential. Being authentic and true to yourself is an important part of that, but it's only half of the story. So Abraham Maslow is primarily a positive psychologist, which is the branch of psychology that studies strengths, virtues, and well-being. But when Maslow was studying self-actualization, he started to branch off into what we would know as developmental psychology, which is the branch of psychology that deals with maturity, development, and the maximization of potential. And that's the part that almost nobody talks about. Most psychologists haven't actually read Maslow's works in depth, which means they've missed out on his focus on the developmental side of self-actualization. And that's actually what he was more concerned about, particularly in the later stages of his research. In the later stages of his career, Abraham Maslow was primarily focused on studying people who he believed had reached the pinnacle of human development. He found that these people operated in an entirely different way. They had very different perspectives on the world. They had very different perspectives on themselves. They possessed a tremendous amount of wisdom. And he often found that they were doing big things in the world. They were achieving a lot. And they were acting in accordance with their human nature and also their unique personality. Now, in the decades following Abraham Maslow's death, a number of developmental psychologists were studying the same thing. They were studying patterns of consciousness, patterns of human development. Okay, and that whole field of study became known as ego development or vertical development. And when you look into that literature, Abraham Maslow's work on self-actualization makes a lot more sense. So developmental psychologists over the last few decades have mapped out a sequence of stages, about 10 in total, that describe a person's way of interpreting the world and how it becomes more complex and mature. At the earliest stages of development, people tend to see the world in simple terms, like rules, rewards, punishment, and social norms. Someone's identity at these stages is largely shaped by external authority and the need for approval. However, as development continues, something begins to change. A person becomes more capable of reflection. They begin questioning assumptions, recognizing contradictions, and taking responsibility for their own beliefs and values. And then, at the higher stages, individuals develop the ability to see multiple perspectives at once. They become more comfortable with complexity, paradox, and uncertainty. Their sense of identity becomes less rigid, and their understanding of reality becomes deeper and more integrated. Now, when you compare Abraham Maslow's work on self-actualization to the research done on ego development, you realize that all of these psychologists were essentially studying the same thing. The patterns of consciousness that Abraham Maslow observed very closely resemble the higher stages of ego development. Now, here's the problem. In popular psychology and in kind of popular culture, we only associate self-actualization with fulfillment. But really, what Abraham Maslow and the developmental psychologists have found is that true self-actualization involves a transformation of consciousness. Okay? Somebody's identity is related to their ability to be fulfilled. And in order to really develop your identity and yourself to the highest possible levels, you need to be able to transform your consciousness into the higher stages of development. Now, you might be wondering, okay, that all sounds good, but how do I actually do that? How can I transform my consciousness to the higher levels, become truly fulfilled, and achieve self-actualization? The good news is that ego development researchers have been able to map out a number of different milestones that people need to hit in order to reach the higher stages of development. One of them is cognitive. You need to be able to transform how you think so you can start relating to the world differently. You can start having higher quality thoughts, more complex thoughts. Okay, so cognitive development is part of it. Emotional development is also a part of it. Being in tune with how you feel, understanding why you feel the way that you feel, also understanding why other people feel the way that they feel. Okay, so it's not just cognitive, there's also an element of heart in there. And then once you get more in tune with your own emotions and other people's emotions, you can start relating to them differently. Okay, it's no longer a case of, independence or dominance or anything like that. You start to be able to become truly interdependent with other people. Okay, so transforming how you relate to other people is a big part of it. And finally, you need to have a relationship to yourself and your identity. And you need to be able to see yourself not just as, a member of your tribe, a member of your nation, and so on. You need to be able to develop your identity in a way that is genuinely authentic to you. And that involves, a little bit of complex thinking. Okay? So there's cognitive elements to this, there's emotional elements to this, there's relational elements, and then there's elements related to self and identity. Now, here's the problem. Unfortunately, in our current society, in order to develop all of these different capacities, it usually requires a university education to hit the cognitive part, thousands of dollars of therapy to hit the self and emotional part, thousands of dollars of executive coaching to master the relational part. Okay? And a lot of people just don't have access to those things. And for me, I was lucky enough, I went to university. You can see the degree on my wall. I've done a whole bunch of therapy. And I also used to work in the executive coaching industry. And so I had access to executive coaches that worked for, Microsoft's C-suite, right? So I've been pretty lucky in terms of my access to these resources. However, I come from a blue-collar city, Hamilton, Ontario, and a lot of people that I grew up with, a lot of people that I know, people that I meet on the street, they don't have tens of thousands of dollars to go to university, get all kinds of therapy, get all kinds of executive coaching and everything. And so unfortunately, the average level of development of Western society is relatively low. And it's primarily because the access to resources isn't there. And so what I've done is a bit of a Robin Hood move. I'm kind of trying to be the Robin Hood of university and executive coaching. So what I've done is I've put together a set of 6 guided journals, which I call the Rehuman program. Okay, and these guided journals hit all of those pillars that I just talked about. The relationship to self and identity, relationship to emotions, cognitive development, relationships with other people. Okay, I've created 6 guided journals that hit all of those. And I'm also using those journals to build skills that you would typically only learn in an executive coaching program or executive coaching engagement. Okay, so I'm teaching leadership, critical thinking, emotional regulation, and even something called reflective practice, which is used in social work and nursing. Okay, so 6 guided journals, which people can buy for the cost of a single therapy session. And my goal with this whole project is to make self-actualization and peak human development accessible to everyone. Okay, so I've got a link in the description to each of the journals so you can check them out. And I also have some bandwidth and some budget to take people on in terms of a research study. So I'm currently working with maybe a half dozen people right now where they're doing some assessments beforehand, then they're completing the journals, and they'll be doing some assessments after. And my goal with this project is to be able to prove that I'm able to catalyze the kinds of transformations within people through guided journals that are typically only available with tens of thousands of dollars of therapy and coaching and education. Okay, so I'm trying to become the Robin Hood of the industry, I suppose. And if you're interested, you can email me or contact me, and it would be fun to have you on as part of the study. So anyway, that's my rant about self-actualization. It's not what most people think it is. Okay, it's not just fulfillment and living your best life and feeling happy. Okay, there's a developmental aspect to this whole thing, which unfortunately has been neglected by mainstream psychology. Okay, most psychologists only know Abraham Maslow's pyramid of needs, hierarchy of needs. They only know about the pyramid. They haven't actually read his books and what he was trying to do with his research. And it's really unfortunate because, as I mentioned, the overall level of development of Western society is rather low right now. And if we can start transforming people's consciousness, if we can start transforming how people relate to themselves and to others, we can improve society as a whole. Okay, people will be better parents, better teachers, better bosses, better politicians. Okay? And yeah, like society will just improve as a whole the more developed that we become. Okay? So yeah, that's my rant. That's my TED Talk. Thank you for watching. And if you have any questions about my journals, feel free to reach out.